Quiet Strength, Chapter 6. It was 1984, and a new kid on the block and would-be competitor to the NFL, the United States Football League, had just been formed. Our defensive coordinator, Woody Weidenhofer, left the Steelers to become the head coach of the USFL's Oklahoma Outlaws. Woody was our defensive staff's second loss in 2 years. George Perles, our assistant head coach, had gone to the Michigan State Spartans as their new head coach in '82. Although I was only 28 at the time and recognized I was awfully young, I also knew I was the coach who knew our defense the best. I hoped I was next in line for the Steelers' defensive coordinator position. A few days after Woody left, we were in New Orleans for the NFL Scouting Combine, an event where guys who will be in that year's draft gather for workouts while NFL scouts watch. Chuck Null asked if I wanted to go with him to Preservation Hall. I had no idea what or where that was, but I figured he must be getting ready to talk to me about becoming the defensive coordinator. We met after dinner in the hotel lobby and walked out into the cool Crescent City evening. Chuck always was a fascinating conversationalist. He spoke of the 1974 Super Bowl the Steelers had been a part of in New Orleans, and then he talked about a number of other topics, all unrelated to football. We arrived at Preservation Hall, a little hole in the wall with a great New Orleans jazz. We kept talking while listening to a guy play the piano for about 45 minutes, and then Chuck got up to leave. "Wasn't that great?" he remarked. I agreed, and we headed out into the chilly night air once again. Chuck began talking about jazz and its origins and how New Orleans jazz was distinctive. I can't say that I learned a whole lot about jazz that night. The whole time we were together, I was trying to figure out if I should say something about the defensive coordinator position or just let the conversation play out, figuring he'd get to it soon enough. He never did, though, and as we returned to the hotel, I realized that I must not be Chuck's choice for the position. When I got home to Pittsburgh, I informed Lauren, who wasn't as ready as I was to accept this decision. She was convinced that I should at least talk with Chuck and ask him why he seemed headed in a different direction. After going back and forth with her for about 4 days, I finally did just that. "Coach, have you given any thought to what you're going to do with the defensive coordinator position?" He looked startled. "Of course, Tony. Nobody knows as much about our defense as you do. That's always been my thought process since Woody left. You're our defensive coordinator." I blew out a breath and gave a rueful laugh, a mixture of relief and exasperation evident on my face. "Were you ever going to tell me that?" "Tony, you're our defensive coordinator." That was just the way Chuck was. Like when I went in at quarterback in 1977, I was the next man in line, even though I didn't know it. Things just kept moving along as planned, at least in his mind. So through several people leaving the Steelers, we have Tony Dungy, who is still quite young, and yet he does know the defense best. He assumes that he's going to get the position maybe, but Chuck Noll has not made him an offer or told him that that is going to be his new position. And through the prodding of his wife, Tony goes, asks Chuck point blank about it, and Chuck's like, "Yeah, of course, you are our new defensive coordinator, right? You know the program best." And so Tony is slowly working his way up in the coaching ranks. The off-season of 1984 also brought us our first child, Tiara. We were in a position financially to allow Lauren to give up teaching and become a full-time mom. Up to this point, Lauren had always been firm in her resolve to keep teaching for a while before having children. But now, only 2.5 years after the wedding, we found ourselves with a baby daughter and a single income. God apparently had a different schedule for us than we had thought. Almost immediately, Lauren and Tiara began to develop the same closeness I had seen Lauren share with her own mom. Being our first child and a girl, Tiara received the royal treatment from us, from both set of grandparents, and from everyone at our church. And not only did she receive attention, she also received clothes. I never realized just how much moms enjoy dressing up their little girls until Tiara came along. She was really a joy, and she got me thinking about the responsibilities of being a father. Up until this point, I had played a lot of golf in the off-season with Bill Nunn, one of the Steelers scouts. But after Tiara was born, I began to play fewer and fewer rounds, just feeling the need to be home as much as I could. Today, I hardly play golf at all. Tiara was the sole recipient of our parental attention until 1987, when Jamie was born. He cut into her territory a little, but she didn't seem to mind. Jamie, of course, set off those thoughts in my mind that I'm sure every father of a boy must have. Will he follow my footsteps? Will I get to play ball with him like my dad did with me? Will he enjoy going to my office as much as I liked going with my father? I was very fortunate to be working for Chuck at this point. We had settled nicely into our coaching routine and never spent needless time at work. He was a very family-oriented, and I never worried that coaching football and raising a family might clash. So Tony's very lucky to be working with the Steelers at this point because he and Lauren are starting their family. They have their daughter Tiara, and then a few years later, a son Jamie is born to them. And sometimes work can be all-consuming, and especially when you think about these coaching jobs and how late some coaches work every night. But Chuck Noll is a very family-oriented guy, and so he makes sure that his coaching staff has a good work-life balance and they are able to spend time with their families. And so fortunately for Tony, he is able to be there with his kids when they're really little and kind of watch them grow up some. Looking back, I can see it was no accident that I felt led to choose a $2,200 signing bonus to play an unfamiliar position with the Steelers rather than take whatever the Bills or Owlettes had offered. In Pittsburgh, I met Lauren, was surrounded by guys who were serious about their faith, won a Super Bowl, and started my coaching career. However, in spite of all these good things, God eventually kicked me out of the Pittsburgh nest. In the spring of 1987, we drafted a very good defensive class: Rod Woodson, Delton Hall, Thomas Everett, Hardy Nickerson, and Greg Lloyd. Those guys all played some in 1987, and we anticipated that they would play even more in 1988. However, as we headed into the 1988 season, we lost some significant leadership. Both Donnie Shell and John Stallworth retired, and Mike Merriweather, the player we had counted on to be the cornerstone of our defense, became embroiled in a contract dispute and sat out the entire season. That was a big loss that we hadn't anticipated, especially in light of the fact that we had let some other veteran leaders go to allow for the development of the 1987 draft class. We went 5-11 in 1988, missing the playoffs for the fourth straight year. Chuck was under a lot of heat and asked me to step down as coordinator, but to stay on staff as the defensive backs coach. I told him I would rather move on, so I resigned and started looking for a job. We were a long way from 1982 when Chuck had told a Pittsburgh paper that my coaching future was unlimited, that Tony could go as far as he wants. Now I was going much farther than I wanted, out of town. Lauren and I certainly wouldn't have left the Steelers if we hadn't had to. This was the first time she had ever even thought about leaving her hometown of Pittsburgh. It was also the first time she got to feel for the tougher side of the NFL. Now I see that was the Lord's way of getting us to a different place, just like when I was traded to San Francisco in 1979. At that time, there was no doubt in my mind that I was to continue coaching. I just didn't know where. I was fortunate to get a lot of calls in the days after I resigned. 4 options stood out from the others: Cincinnati, Kansas City, the New York Giants, and San Francisco. My first choice was to go to Cincinnati. The Steelers played them twice a year, and I had known the coach, Sam Wyche, from my year playing for the 49ers, when he was on Bill Walsh's staff. Sam called me before the Super Bowl and said he was probably going to lose his defensive line coach. He wanted to know if I'd be interested. I liked Sam a lot. The Bengals had had a good team, and Cincinnati was a medium-sized city close to Pittsburgh. Although I didn't know many of their players, I had become good friends with Anthony Munoz while doing some camps with him for Athletes in Action. All in all, it seemed to be a good fit for us. Lauren and I rooted for the Bengals to beat the 49ers in the Super Bowl that year, all the time thinking we'd be working for the Super Bowl champs in 1989. They lost to the 49ers in the last minute of the game. After getting back to Cincinnati, Sam called me with bad news. Mike Brown, who had taken over the ownership of the Bengals from his dad, Paul Brown, felt I was really a defensive backs coach rather than a line coach. He was also worried that I would not be content as a position coach, and that I would probably be looking to move on if a coordinator position became available elsewhere. Sam concluded by reluctantly confessing that he couldn't hire me. Shortly following the conversation with Sam, the other participants in Super Bowl called. Bill Walsh told me he was retiring after their Super Bowl win, and that George Seifert was going to take over as head coach of the 49ers. Denny Green had taken the Stanford head coaching job right before the Super Bowl, so Bill wanted me to coach the 49ers running backs. Although Bill was going to work in the front office, he obviously was not taking a hands-off role when it came to hiring a staff for George. While I had played for him in San Francisco only that 1 year, Bill Walsh and I had talked a great deal after I got into coaching, and he was definitely someone with whom I had a great relationship. He told me he felt I had a great chance to be head coach, and that I could make myself an even stronger candidate by moving over to offense and joining a championship caliber team. At the same time, an opportunity with the Giants was on the table. Although Bill Parcells was still in his early days as head coach of the New York Giants, he had already won one Super Bowl. The Giants had a cornerback on their roster, Harvey Clayton, whom I had coached for 3 years in Pittsburgh. Bill thought Harvey was well trained and brought me in to interview, which turned out to be great fun, considering it was a job interview. He already had Bill Belichick and Romeo Crennel on staff, and the four of us would have talked defensive football philosophy all day if the weather had cooperated. But a snowstorm was blowing into the New York area that evening, and Bill wanted to get me out before I got stranded. I wanted to get home too, although being stranded with those three wouldn't have been a bad alternative. Meanwhile, Marty Schottenheimer had just gotten the head coaching job in Kansas City after leaving the Cleveland Browns in a dispute over assistant coaches. Marty interviewed me for the Chiefs' defensive coordinator position, but he had already decided he was going to run the system he had used in Cleveland and hire Bill Cowher as the coordinator. He wanted me to come as defensive backs coach. Marty said that part of his reason in hiring Cowher over me was that he couldn't promote someone from the outside over someone from within. I appreciated his candor as well as that philosophy. As I went through this decision-making process, I was surprised by the pay scale of these NFL teams. It was unlike anything I'd seen in Pittsburgh. Each of these teams offered me more to be a position coach than I'd been making as a coordinator in Pittsburgh. I liked all three situations, and once again there was no booming voice from the sky clearly telling me which way to go. I knew Bill Walsh, but he wouldn't be my direct boss. I hadn't known Bill Parcells at all, but had come to really like him in the little time I'd spent with him. Both the Giants and the 49ers were definitely Super Bowl caliber teams, but in the end, I just didn't feel comfortable taking 4-year-old Tiara and 2-year-old Jamie to either of those two big cities. So after talking and praying about it, Laura and I decided on Kansas City. So here we have Tony with a wife and 2 little kids, and he's trying to decide what's best for his family and where to move them. And he does have a couple of offers and options out on the table, and which he's very blessed and fortunate to have. And he ultimately decides to go with the Kansas City team. And in Kansas City, he's going to be a defensive backs coach. So he's going from being a defense coordinator to being a defensive backs coach. Although Lauren was initially worried about leaving her parents and siblings, Kansas City turned out to be a place of great growth for our marriage and for Lauren personally. She developed many new friendships and finally had her own home to set up and furnish, since she had simply moved into my place after we were married. In some ways, life in Kansas City was easier for Lauren than it had been in Pittsburgh. In Kansas City, more of the coaches were closer to our age, which made their wives her peers. In Pittsburgh, the next youngest coach had been in his 40s, with teenage children. I was so young when I was hired by the Steelers that we were closer in age to the players and their wives than we were to the coaches, which was somewhat awkward. In the space of 2 years, I had gone from being one of the guys to being management. Lauren had become close with Paulette Schell and Flo Stallworth, which was terrific for her, but still a bit awkward since I was technically Donnie Schell's boss. Those issues didn't exist in Kansas City. Working for the Chiefs continued to mold my coaching philosophy and reinforce my desire to maintain a balance between work and the rest of my life. Up to this point, we hadn't realized the number of hours that some NFL coaching staffs were required to work. In Pittsburgh, I had been home nearly every night for dinner. That all changed in Kansas City. So I moved to Kansas City because it is a smaller place. It's not as large, let's say, San Francisco or New York, where his other job offers were. And he said it ended up being a great move for them in terms of Lauren, like making the house her own and getting friends their own age and so forth and so on. But from how he ends that section, it does sound like the work-life balance is not going to be as good as it was in Pittsburgh. I met Herman Edwards back in 1977 at the Hula Bowl and again at the Japan Bowl, both college all-star games. A cornerback out of San Diego State, Herm played on the West teams in each game, while I played on the East teams. He always reminds me that I was driving for the winning score in Japan, on my way to the game's MVP award, according to him, when I threw an interception at the end of the game. To Herm. For some reason, we hit it off anyway and stayed friends as we both came into the NFL as undrafted free agents. We played at opposite ends of Pennsylvania, Herm with the Eagles and I with the Steelers. Many people who remember Herm's playing career don't remember him by name. Instead, they remember him as the hero of the Miracle in the Meadowlands. This play got the Giants coach fired and created a new formation. In the victory formation, the quarterback takes the snap from the center and, rather than handing the ball off to a running back, merely drops to one knee while another player stands several yards behind as a safety measure. This ends the play when the clock keeps running. Okay. Did you know that fact? Herm's heroics came late in the 1978 season, with the Eagles needing a win to stay in the playoff chase. The Giants were leading 17-12 and merely needed to run the last 31 seconds off the clock. Their quarterback, Joe Pizzart, took the snap but stumbled as he attempted to hand the ball off to the running back, Larry Konoska. Konoska never got the handoff cleanly. The ball hit the turf of the Giants stadium and bounced right up to thigh level in front of a hard-charging Herm. Herm scooped up the ball and ran it 26 yards into the end zone, giving the Eagles the win. After that, coaches everywhere began using the victory formation to eliminate the possibility of last-minute disaster from games that should be already won. Herm and I continued to stay close even after I went into coaching and he kept playing. When his playing career ended, Herm headed to San Jose State to become their defensive backs coach. Then in 1989, my first year as defensive backs coach with the Kansas City Chiefs, Herm and I spent more time together when he joined us as an intern for training camp. Chiefs head coach Marty Schottenheimer had the disconcerting trait, at least in my mind, of not needing much sleep, often working late into the night. And back then, he was also a micromanager who wanted to be on top of everything that took place on the practice field and in the assistant coaches' meetings. Many an evening concluded with Marty pulling out the film from that day's camp practices to watch individual drills one more time. Usually this was at 11 or 11:30 at night, which meant we wouldn't finish the day until 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. Whenever Marty started one of these sessions, Herm would cut a glance at me, shrug, and go off to fix popcorn. This late-night routine continued into the regular season. Although I always longed to get home to Lauren and our children, there was never a question for me that I was born to coach, even as I endured Marty's hours in the office. So the head coach for Kansas City is a guy named Marty Schottenheimer, who does not have the same philosophy of having a good work-life balance as Chuck Noll did with the Steelers. Marty is fine with not sleeping much and working all hours of the night, which is hard for a guy like Tony who has a young family because he never gets to see them that often now. Even though in Kansas City I sometimes found myself on the job at 3 o'clock in the morning watching film for Marty, I still enjoyed coaching more than anything else I had done. After those crazy hours, however, Herm and I vowed that if we ever had the chance to make the schedule ourselves, we wouldn't spend or allow our assistants to spend that much time in the office. With Chuck Noll, I had seen firsthand that it was possible to work fewer hours and still be successful. I didn't like the burden my absence in the evenings placed on Lauren, who was at home alone with the kids. Bill Parcells and the Giants won the Super Bowl that year, and San Francisco went on to win 2 titles under George Seifert. As for the Chiefs, the 1989 season in Kansas City couldn't have been more perfect. Working for Lamar Hunt was just as good as working for Mr. Rooney, and I also came to appreciate the approach of the other owners in that bunch, Mr. Mara of the Giants and Eddie DeBartolo of the 49ers. Lauren and I knew we had to make the right decision to come to Kansas City. I learned a lot about taking care of details from working with Marty Schottenheimer, and I really enjoyed working with Bill Cowher. It also didn't hurt that I was coaching a tremendous group of defensive backs. All 4 starters were Pro Bowlers at some point in their careers. I still considered those 3 years, when I was responsible for 8 players rather than the whole defense, to be my favorite years of pure coaching. Not only was I able to focus my attention on details that would make them better players, I got the opportunity to really know them as people. So he says during his time at Kansas City that those years when he was responsible for 8 players rather than the whole defense, that those were his favorite years of pure coaching. And the reason why is because he got to really know his players as people. And when you get to know your players, let's say your students, on an individual level, you're able to pour into them more and encourage them in the right areas more and understand where they really struggle and where their strengths are, and to help them make them then better students or to make them better players. And so we see here the earlier influence of his mom here, where she liked to get to know her students and to help them succeed in the best way possible, and Tony clearly has taken that trait on as a coach. After I'd been with the Chiefs for 3 seasons, Chuck Noll retired from the Steelers, and Bill Cowher left Kansas City to replace him as head coach. The Chiefs lost to the Buffalo Bills in the playoffs in January of 1992. A week later, Lauren and I watched the Buffalo-Denver AFC Championship game from the hospital while waiting for Eric to be born. Losing to Buffalo the week before was actually a bit of a blessing for me personally. If we had won, I would have had to make a tough decision. Would I have gone to Denver with my team for a championship game, or stayed in Kansas City with Lauren, who was almost ready to deliver? I'm glad I didn't have to make that choice. I like to think I would have made the right one, though. I soon faced another choice, however, that was no less daunting, at least in Lauren's eyes. Marty had previously told me that if Bill Cowher ever left, I would be his new defensive coordinator. Just as Bill was taking the Pittsburgh job, Denny Green left Stanford to become head coach of the Minnesota Vikings. Denny contacted me and asked me to become his defensive coordinator. I had gotten to know and like Denny when I played in San Francisco, where he was part of the 49ers coaching staff under Bill Walsh. But since I fully anticipated becoming the defensive coordinator in Kansas City, I planned to decline Denny's offer. Then Marty suggested that I go check out the Minnesota job. As it turned out, he had already decided to hire Dave Adolph of the Raiders as his new defensive coordinator. Dave and Marty were close friends, and Dave had been Marty's defensive coordinator in Cleveland. Marty hadn't yet told me of his decision to hire Dave, but Lauren sensed something was different with the Schottenheimers. Hiring Dave Adolph didn't sit well with me, based on Marty's assurance that I would be the next coordinator. I reminded Marty of the conversation we'd had 3 years earlier when he told me he couldn't hire someone from the outside over guys who had been within the organization. He did remember our conversation, but he said this was a special circumstance he couldn't have anticipated. Lauren wanted me to stay on as the Chiefs' defensive backs coach, but I didn't feel like that was a good option for me anymore, given the way things had played out. I knew I wouldn't be able to put my heart into my work, a crucial ingredient for success. Lauren was suspicious that I'd orchestrated the whole thing just to get back to Minnesota. But while I was really looking forward to working with Denny Green, my decision actually had more to do with my need to leave the Chiefs than with where we were headed. It wasn't that I was mad at Marty Schottenheimer. I know he felt bad about going back on a promise, but he had never anticipated the opportunity to be reunited with Dave Adolph. I looked at it, once again, as God moving me into a situation where I would never have chosen to move myself. This wouldn't be the last time it would happen. After I became a head coach, I had much more empathy for Marty's position. Things do happen that you can't anticipate. As a result, I've learned not to make many promises to players or coaches, and Marty and I remain good friends to this day. Lauren, for good reasons, did not want to move, since she had just given birth to Eric, our third child, the very week Denny contacted me. But Denny is pretty savvy. He knew he needed to recruit Lauren, not just me. Minnesota in January can be intimidating, with average highs around 22 degrees. Kansas City isn't particularly balmy at that time of year either, but Lauren had a full support system there. So when Denny invited me to interview in Minneapolis, he invited Lauren for the interview as well. So here he's been waiting to be promoted within the Kansas City organization, but when it comes down to it, the head coach ends up hiring his friend for the new position rather than Tony. And Tony realizes, okay, I don't have a chance here to move up in this organization, at least for like quite some time, if ever. So he starts looking around, and he knows the guy who is the head coach for the Minnesota Vikings, Denny Green. And so he's offered that position, that job. His wife does not want to move to Minnesota because, hello, it's so cold up there. But he takes her up there with him to check out the situation. We brought Eric, who was only 8 days old, when we traveled to Minnesota for our visit. Kristen Lindenberg, Denny's secretary, took care of the baby the whole time we visited with Denny. Of course, being back in Minnesota was like being home for me, even though the weather was painfully cold. Lauren wasn't looking forward to leaving Kansas City at all. And given that she didn't yet know the full details of what was going on behind the scenes with the Chiefs, she was understandably not very open to the possibility. I believe her exact words were, "You're dragging me and a 1-week-old baby into the sub-zero Arctic." Unlike our move from Pittsburgh, where after praying about it we both felt the change was right, Lauren just didn't want to leave Kansas City. However, she understood that if we stayed, though I might be able to make it work, I would not be in the right frame of mind. Reluctantly, she agreed to support me, and we survived the move. So even though his wife doesn't want to, they end up moving to Minnesota to be a part of the Minnesota Vikings organization. Although it was difficult for us to leave Kansas City in 1992, working for the Minnesota Vikings gave me the preparation I still needed to be effective as a head coach. During those 4 years in Minnesota, I grew as a coach and as a leader. Denny Green imparted wisdom I've drawn upon every year since then in my head coaching career. Denny was very concerned with the efficient use of time and sticking with the schedule. In the process, he made certain that his assistant coaches spent time with their families. He reinforced the idea of head coach as CEO, a model I've seen in Coach Stoll and Coach Knoll. Denny trusted his assistant coaches and knew the importance of not spending too much time on just one side of the ball. In addition, Denny always ran the scout teams. The scout teams are the backup players who simulate the opponent's offense and defense in practice. Having the head coach direct the scout teams served two purposes. First, it made everybody realize the importance of the scout team and made the scout players pay attention. Second, it gave Denny a great opportunity to get a first-hand look at his young players and backups. That's why years later, after the 1999 season, Denny was able to release two outstanding quarterbacks, Jeff George and Randall Cunningham, with confidence. Denny had seen Dante Culpepper's talent on the scout team, even though Dante hadn't taken any game snaps during his rookie year in 1999. So even though his wife didn't want to move to Minnesota, this actually ends up being a really good career move for Tony Dungy because he learns a lot under the head coach of the Minnesota Vikings, Denny Green. And one of the things that he really likes about Denny Green's style is, again, being family focused and making sure that his coaches are able to actually spend time with their families. And Denny is also the CEO type of coach that really delegates responsibility to his assistant coaches, which in turn gives them more experience as well. Denny also believed that his assistant coaches should interact with the media. Being under the media microscope is an acquired skill. I knew how important it was for me to articulate my thoughts and help the media do their jobs without giving away information the club needed to keep private. There's a strong trend around the league these days towards silencing assistants, with various clubs having a one-voice doctrine. I can appreciate that to some extent. It makes it easier for a head coach to craft a message and keep everyone on the same page. At the same time, however, league rules mandate that we give the media access to our players, so the reality is that information is flowing from various sources within the organization anyway. At the end of the day, the only people a one-voice doctrine silences are those who should be the most loyal, the assistant coaches. If people really want to leak something to the press, they can and will do so, with or without a strict media policy. The major consideration for me today, as it was for Denny then, is the development of assistant coaches in a league environment in which the media are increasingly hungry. In the course of any given week, the head coach holds a post-game press conference immediately following the game, a post-mortem press conference the following day, a midweek conference call with the opponent's local media, various other interviews, a production meeting the day before the game with network announcers who will broadcast the game, plus any game day interviews for the team's local radio partner. And that's just for a routine regular season game. That sounds exhausting. For each of these interviews, the coach had better not slip. All NFL coaches have, at one time or another, said something without thinking through all the ramifications. In this era, with so much sports-related media, every comment by the head coach is likely to be dissected and discussed at length, and anyone can express an opinion in an online blog. This places a tremendous pressure on the head coach to say exactly what needs to be said at every moment. As I allow my assistant coaches to interact with the media, they take some of the media pressure off of me. More important, their work with the media allows them to develop these skills during their tenure with me. Their promotion at some point to a head coaching position will carry enough shock, and dealing with the media is guaranteed to be one of the most difficult transitions. I want to help prepare them. An assistant coach who becomes a head coach should not have to go from having no interaction with the media whatsoever to being a lead voice of the team. It's too much to expect someone to master that skill without some on-the-job experience. I owe a great deal to Denny for helping me develop my media relations skills, and I in turn want to do the same for my assistants. So again, these are skills that he learned from Denny Green that he then himself applies as a head coach now. Denny Green supported his assistant coaches' families. He allowed our children to be at training camp and scheduled days off so we could get home. Chuck Knoll was like this too, although no one on our Pittsburgh staff had young children at the time. When I started coaching in Minnesota, Tiara was 7, Jamie was 5, and Eric was just an infant, so I went home often. During the regular season, we usually finished our day's work before 9 o'clock in the evening. In the meantime, Herm Edwards had taken my old job as defensive backs coach at Kansas City and was working those exhausting hours with Marty. More often than not, Herm would come out of his first evening staff meeting and find a voicemail message from me on his office phone before he headed into the second, late staff meeting. "Hey Herm, just checking in. It's about 8:30 right now, and Jamie's sitting here preparing my instruction cards for practice tomorrow while I look over some notes. Remember to go find some popcorn, and you'll be done in 6-7 hours tops. Look, I don't want to stay on the phone too long, because I'm about to head to bed. Catch you later." May not have been the kindest thing to do, but Herm and I still share a good laugh over it, and I'm sure he deserved it as retaliation for something. I'm not entirely certain why Denny Green chose me over the many other coaches on the Viking staff he could have mentored. The staff had some tremendous minds, including Brian Billick, Tyrone Willingham, and Tom Moore, who would move on to other great things. Denny knew me from having been my special teams coach during the year I played in San Francisco. During my time in Minnesota, as my name gained momentum in league circles, much of my success was due to Denny's mentoring. Maybe he figured it was only a matter of time before I was a head coach. Denny made sure he involved me in the decision-making loop whenever possible. When it wasn't possible, he talked with me afterward to explain the factors that had been involved in making the decision. He didn't necessarily care if I agreed with him, but he did want me to start thinking in ways that would develop my decision-making ability. For instance, in 1992, Denny wrestled with the decision to bench Rich Gannon in favor of Sean Salisbury. As he worked through the process, Denny let me know what he was thinking. In part, he needed my assistance in selling such a dramatic change to defensive players. But he went beyond that to explain why he thought the change was important and what the pros and cons were for the switch. He wasn't asking for my opinion. He was challenging me to think through the situation as if I were the head coach. Normally, as a defensive coordinator, I would not have even thought about decisions like that, but these were the types of decisions I would have to make when I became a head coach and saw even more variables. I'm thankful Denny gave me so many trial runs behind the scenes. I've always viewed myself as loyal, even if it meant being somewhat stubborn. By my last year in Minnesota, I was growing increasingly popular with the media. Denny had never been a media favorite, even though we were winning. At one point, speculation was circulating that Denny was on a short leash. A good friend asked me if I would take the head coaching job if the Vikings fired Denny. No. My friend pressed the point. From his perspective, if Denny were no longer the coach, the position would be empty. I wouldn't really be replacing him. So he asked again if I would take the job. No. Dennis Green gave me this job as defensive coordinator. I will not take his job. My friend's logic was probably more solid than mine, but I stuck by my answer. There are certain bridges that are not worth crossing. No matter what others think, loyalty and relationships are important. On a more practical note, I was also thinking about Lauren. She's more anxious than anyone for me to get a head coaching job in another city so we could escape the Minnesota winters. Although it seemed at the time that I might never get a head coaching job, the Lord already had one picked out for me. Here at the end, we see that Tony is not only like this good guy who really learns a lot from his mentors, but he's also extremely loyal towards them. And when people start talking about, okay, what if, Denny gets fired from the head coaching job of the Minnesota Vikings? Would you ever want it? And Tony says, I would never do that to my friend. And he says there are certain bridges that are not worth crossing, no matter what others might think.